Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Owens, and I'm the director of the risk control team at HI Group. Thank you for joining us for our session, Cybersecurity Spotlight, Responding to a Cyber Incident. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be made available to registered attendees, along with other session materials following the conference. If you have any questions during the session, please submit them using the Q&A panel. We'll address as many as possible during the live session. Joining us today, we have David Anderson and Dave Nowacki of CLA National Digital Group. David is a principal and cybersecurity consultant with CLA. He has more than 13 years of experience performing penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, and social engineering engagements. Dave is a director with the CLA cybersecurity team, part of the National Digital Group. He has more than 23 years of combined experience in cybersecurity, IT controls, enterprise risk management, internal audit, and management consulting. I'm going to hand it over to you both. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Beth. Appreciate the introduction. And speaking for Nowacki and myself, we're super excited to be with you all here this afternoon talking about cybersecurity and how to be resilient. And we're excited to bring forward this content, looking forward to the questions that you ask. I think the biggest thing when we do these type of events and webinars is being able to engage with the audience and hear what's on your mind. So definitely encourage the audience to ask questions on this topic, and anything that we don't get to here this afternoon, we can respond as a follow-up here. So we're super excited to talk about cybersecurity, how to be cyber resilient, and what do you do when that bad thing happens from a cybersecurity perspective. And so if we talk through our agenda that we're going to walk through here this afternoon, I'm going to open it up talking about risks and trends. I think it's important to spend a moment to really kind of zero in, why are we talking about this topic to begin with? What's going on out there in the world? What are the threat actors doing? What are the types of cyber attacks that are common that organizations face? Just so that we can paint the picture of why it's important to be resilient. From that, we're going to start zeroing in to talk about, okay, in order to protect our organization and to be prepared for that worst case scenario, it's good to have a formalized cybersecurity program. So we're just going to touch on what is a cybersecurity program, what are some of the elements of a cybersecurity program, and then we're going to zero in further to talk about incident response planning within that cybersecurity program, about being able to withstand a cyber attack so that you can, it's always perfect when we can stop it from occurring to begin with, but when that bad thing does occur, can we make sure that our team is prepared so that we can identify what's going on, respond to it, and recover quickly? And at the end, we're going to bring it all home with a case study. We're actually going to walk through a real life example from a client that we've worked with that experienced a cyber attack. I'm going to talk through what occurred and then tie it back to that incident response plan and some of the lessons learned of things that either were done or maybe could have been done that would have helped that organization out. And so with that, we'll jump right in to talk about cybersecurity risks and trends. And what's driving a lot of this today is money. There are nation state threat actors out there that are performing hacking activities for geopolitical purposes, right? We don't want to ignore that. However, the bulk of what most of the people probably in this audience are facing day in and day out is more traditional cybercrime that is really geared towards just making money. It's financially motivated. Within the hacking world, the hackers have built a whole underground economy related to hacking and fraud. They've developed specialization even. And what do I mean by that? Nowadays, you have hackers who are software developers. You think of a traditional software development that works for a software company making applications. There are now fraudsters or hackers out around the world who specialize in software development, but the software that they are writing is malicious in nature. they probably aren't the ones actually using that software for nefarious purposes. They are selling their software to other hackers. And so this whole underground market related to hacking activity has developed. There are websites on the dark web that hackers congregate in where they can buy and sell illicit goods, right? You can go on the dark web and buy illegal drugs and weapons and stolen data. A common example is stolen credit card data. You can go on the dark web and buy card data or other personal information for committing identity theft. And one of the more recent examples now is hackers have developed this concept of ransomware as a service. You've probably heard of software as a service. Think of like Microsoft 365 hosting your email. You don't have your own email server anymore. You just subscribe to your email. Nowadays, you don't need to be a sophisticated hacker to do ransomware. You can go on the dark web and you can subscribe to these ransomware as a service products, and hackers will give you the tools to execute ransom attacks yourself. And so the world has evolved greatly in the last 10 years related to cybercrime. The criminals are always looking for new ways to commit fraud and to steal money, whether it's diverting payments, impacting your operations. And there's an element here that to hackers, generally we kind of all look the same, right? No matter what business you in, no matter how large or how small or what industry you're in, everyone has money that can be stolen. Everyone has business operations that relies on IT that they can disrupt. And hackers are abusing those to try to make money from us. One common way they're making money right now is through something that's called business email compromise. This is such a prevalent threat that the FBI has part of their website that's dedicated to business email compromise. Business email compromise is just a fancy term for hackers compromising credentials that allow you to get into the email system. Hackers getting in the email system and leveraging email communication to try to commit fraud. And that could be, changing vendor payments, impersonating an employee to change direct deposit, getting an employee to buy gift cards and scratching off the codes. It's interesting because they're not using malware. It's more of a social engineering. They're just getting in the email communication platform and then tricking someone to take that action. And it's so devastating that the FBI estimates that it's cost US businesses $55 billion over the last several years with this type of fraud. This is when I talk to folks in the cyber insurance industry, a lot of people I talk to say this is the most common cyber claim that they have to deal with is hackers convincing someone over email to, send that wire out to the wrong party. Another common type of cyber attack is ransomware. And I know ransomware has been touched on in some of the earlier sessions. It's important for us to know, or I think it's interesting to look at some of the statistics related to ransomware. Sophos is a cybersecurity company that does research on ransomware, and they survey thousands of businesses every year to see what is the impact related to ransomware. Good news, you can see from 2023 to 2024, there was a slight decrease in businesses being targeted with a ransomware event, but 59% is still a large percentage, in my opinion. And then if you look down to the bottom graphic in the bottom right corner, where we're looking at 2025, some of the latest data that just came out a month or two ago, for those businesses that were targeted with a ransomware attack, which ones actually suffered encryption? And you can see that of those targeted, 44% actually suffered encryption of their data. 50% were able to stop it before it got to the encryption point. And then an additional 6%, it wasn't encrypted, but the hackers were still able to steal sensitive data and come back with the second ransom demand related to their data. And I'll touch on that in a moment here. If we look at another graph that talks about the root cause of ransomware attacks, what I find interesting is in the last few years, exploited vulnerability has been the top root cause. when I talk to folks about ransomware, a lot of people assume, okay, it's phishing or emails related to ransomware. But actually, in the last few years, hackers have been looking for out-of-date vulnerable software to initiate their ransomware attack. You can take a step back and think back over, the last 10 to 20 years, and you talk about IT best practices and, patching your systems has always been there, right? And this reinforces that need to make sure that we're on top of applying security updates. And unfortunately, the last couple of years, a lot of the ransomware attacks have been targeting some of your security devices. I've seen several critical vulnerabilities in firewall devices and VPN appliances that hackers find a vulnerability and exploit their security device, and that's what gets them into the network to begin with.
Yep. And just to add, I think that it's important to note that like the words vulnerability and exploit kind of take different shapes and forms. We think traditional devices, but the rapid expansion in the last 10 years or so into cloud environments, adoption of Microsoft business applications, Google business applications, all of those can have their own flavor of not being configured properly or a vulnerability, and can open the door for attackers to get in and potentially launch the social engineering or a ransomware scheme. And so it's very interesting, David. At its core, even though these are individual root causes, do you see this as the root cause? Is this a people thing? Is it a process thing? Is it a resource thing? What is it? To add a little bit more color to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If we take this concept of exploited vulnerability being the technical root cause, well, that is implying that these devices aren't patched. And that may sound like a technical issue. But I like to take a step back and think through there's likely process related issues then. If you don't have good processes around inventorying your assets, right? There are various frameworks out there for cybersecurity and identifying good security controls to have. The Center for Internet Security has, their top 18 critical controls. And the first two things on that list is inventory your hardware and inventory your software, right? And knowing what you need to patch, and then having a program and a process to identify vulnerabilities when they're discovered and to quickly apply those patches. So it's definitely more than a technical issue. It ends up being a process issue.
That makes sense. I think, it might make some sense to kind of dive into the profile of a ransomware attack next, as well.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to note here related to the rise in ransomware is how it's evolved. Back in the day, it used to be you got ransomware just locked up your local PC. Then it became network aware and it could encrypt your network files. Fast forward all the way to today, a typical ransomware attack, the hackers get in your network and try to remain hidden and stealthy so you don't know they're there. They find a way to compromise your network and compromise the IT admin account. Then what they do is they look for your sensitive data, they steal your sensitive data, then they look for your backups, and then they try to delete or corrupt your backups, and then they're deploying the ransom. So in the end, there's actually commonly two ransom demands coming out of this, where the first ransom demand is pay us to unlock your data. And then they come back again, say, okay, pay us to not disclose, we stole all your employees' personal information, socials, addresses, et cetera. If you don't pay us, we're going to leak that data publicly online. And then we've seen lately kind of a third variant where the hackers are going after those victims. So in this case, let's say hypothetically, hackers stole the employee data. We've seen the hackers contacting the employees directly and saying, we hacked your business where you work. And if your company doesn't pay us, we're going to release your personal data to the world. And they're trying to get the employees to put pressure on the business to pay that ransom. And so it's a very unfortunate situation to be in because obviously the businesses want to help protect their employees and the data that they have. And you don't want to pay the ransom, but sometimes they get put in that bind where they feel like they almost need to.
Makes sense. And you look at just the complexity of it, of this type of attack, it quickly becomes, not just an IT issue. It becomes a business issue. It becomes a reputational issue and a number of other things that can start to impact.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And if I were to close out on the risks and trends, Verizon is a company that does research on data breaches, and their latest report just echoes some of these similar things. A couple highlights from their data. One is they say credential theft continues to be very common. Hackers are all about compromising your passwords because then they can log into your email or any other cloud services. Now that we've moved to the cloud for everything, right? Credential compromise is a huge threat. We talked about vulnerable software. Hackers are attacking vulnerable software to facilitate things like ransomware attacks. And then ransomware, tying that into data breaches. The intersection there, what that tells you is that more and more ransomware attacks involve the hackers stealing your data as part of that ransomware attack. So it's not just business disruption, but there's data loss and there's, data protection issues, privacy issues that you may have to work through from a legal standpoint. So with that, I think it's good for us to transition, Nowacki, to start maybe talking about a cybersecurity program. It's like there's all this bad stuff out in the world. What do we do to try to combat that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is kind of the complexity of these attacks are multifaceted, right? And so, we'll highlight, an approach to making sure that you are building resiliency into your environment. And the focus of this is obviously on incident response and recovery and kind of how that converges with some of the earlier conversations about business continuity and ensuring the continuity of operations and services to support your missions. But I'm spotlighting, as whether you're quasi public, non-for-profit, or even in private industry, there's some really good tools out there to kind of frame an approach to cybersecurity resilience. And one that I like to point out is the NIST cybersecurity framework. NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technologies. I'll focus your attention to the visual on the left. The inner circle is the most important. This is a program to continuously anticipate potential threats to your environment, the continuity of operations and services, considering cybersecurity as a unique type of threat that could resonate both technical, but also in terms of person threats, exploiting the nature of the humans that work in your environments and the need to be responsive, timely in responding to requests. Also, balancing missions with other priorities, right? And so that govern inner circle really is a framework to allow for you to anticipate threats, plan ahead, be as proactive and preventive as you can be, but then also once you detect something, how quickly can you escalate it? And so, the functions on the left, the govern along with identify and protect, that's your classic cybersecurity strategy. You have antivirus programs, you have access controls, multi-factor authentication, things that are designed to not have bad things happen. But a huge part of this framework, and it is one of the most popular frameworks out there, is that detect, respond, and recover. And 50 to 60% of the controls, best practices, and other things that you should be looking to implement have to do with not if, but when bad things happen, how prepared are you? How quickly can you escalate? How well are you prepared to communicate both internally and externally? And then ultimately that respond, recover to make sure you're minimizing disruptions. I think within this program, I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about what can we do? What the broader landscape? What allows you to have minimize disruptions? And so, diversifying your physical locations. Flashing back 15 years ago, a lot of organizations, and many still do, but a lot of organizations were solely reliant on the servers and systems that were in their data centers, their server rooms installed on PCs and the like. And so, the adoption of cloud technologies have allowed organizations to basically diversify where they can access data from, also share some of the risk when it comes to both foundational security, as well as the ability to respond and recover using technologies like cloud platforms and the like. It does allow for better and more rapid recovery and recovery time objectives. And I know in earlier panel discussions, we talked a lot about maximum tolerable downtime, some recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, and how that data can begin to align in a classic BCP program, but allowing you to have diversity in physical locations supports that as well. Software as a service platforms to be able to be, remotely working and accessing major systems, major applications in the cloud or in a software as a service application takes almost all of the burden off of you to secure the environment beyond initial configuration. And so, we learned a lot during the pandemic, the rapid adoption of things like Zoom, which we're presenting on today, Microsoft Teams and other platforms that allow us to be location agnostic. And still, if we need to move outside of our offices for a time period, or even perpetually, you're prepared, your workforce is prepared to access systems remotely. And so that's a really, really positive trend. A couple other things I'll hit on, that kind of go without saying, more in the technical side, and we'll get to some of the other complexities of this as well. But making sure that you're not leaving that your traditional network security, defense in depth, and security tooling aside, and solely relying on incident response. So always having some principles of defense in depth and building redundancy into your systems, both from a backup recovery, but also things like the ability to revert to a failed over or backed up system fairly quickly. Being cognizant of your technical weaknesses that you're either built in by design, or that you may not have the right processes, to David's point earlier, to proactively patch and minimize weaknesses. And then that bottom, and we'll get into this in the next few slides, knowing your vendors, because of this reliance on third-party vendors, there's also some susceptibility and potential risk to be made, by having vendors and by not engaging in the right way with your vendors. So it is really important to make sure you have some visibility into that. It looks like we have a question before we head to the next slide. Has progress been made in catching perpetrators of these crimes and curbing this behavior?
I would say what I've seen is the authorities are continuing to pursue these criminals across the world. It is very challenging. There's a lot of tools at the disposal of these fraudsters to try to stay hidden. So there's a component of even identifying who the true threat actor is that is difficult. And then once you identify them, oftentimes they may be residing in countries where we don't have a great relationship with that country. And so we do see every so often what the FBI and other authorities are able to go and apprehend these criminals, but it is slow going. And so I haven't seen, when you say progress, I see progress as in they are persistent and they continue to put effort towards this. But I have not seen it get better where they're able to catch him more quickly and more efficiently. It still seems like in general, it takes a lot of time and effort and energy.
And I would say some of the complexities we've seen over time, cryptocurrencies and anonymity that allows, it's very difficult to trace the money back to bad actors when you have an ability to have these economies that operate and they're largely dependent on, untraceable funds. So,
yeah. When you're talking about vendors, I think it's interesting, vendors have allowed us to be more resilient and to share some of the risk, but it also introduces risk. And so it's not, there's always the other side of the coin, so to speak. And I like using this example here. This is an example of a popular software company. They write ERP software, and they enabled a new feature for mobile access, for access from mobile devices. So from your phone or a tablet, you could remote in and interact with your ERP platform. There was like a module, I believe, for people to put in time, for time entry, for time tracking, for employees. And to enable mobile access, the vendor would expose the database of that software to the internet. And so this was traditional on-premise software. So software they bought from a vendor, installed it on a local server, but then they exposed that server to the internet. And unfortunately, this vendor put in hard-coded SQL passwords on their database server, which was shared in every installation. Hackers found that password, and so all of a sudden, the customers who enabled the mobile app feature started getting hacked. Hackers were accessing the database with that default password, and then were deploying ransomware from that server. And so what this is doing is highlighting some of the challenges you all face with leveraging third parties and being more reliant on third parties, where sometimes it can be more difficult to understand the security implications of that relationship, whether you're putting software in your environment or maybe you're outsourcing, the IT function to a third-party provider, et cetera. Nowacki, what are your thoughts? Do you have other insights related to vendor risk or third-party risk?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this is a broad spectrum of people who are not primarily, located in your organization. You may have a contractual or business relationship with them. It's kind of the business partner. Traditional information security programs look at this from a vendor perspective, meaning like you have a contract, they provide you services, and you kind of look at that. I like to broaden it up. Business partners that you may not have a monetary partnership with, but could have some connectivity to your system, or could be contacts that could be used if they're compromised. The attack could come from a legitimate email account from a business partner, for example, that you wouldn't be expecting traditionally, and they may not have your data, but they have an ability to kind of weave in, social engineer their way in if their organizations are compromised. Business partner risk, third party risk, which is your traditional vendors, and then fourth party risk. So your vendors or your business partners vendors is a major trend, in addition to what David covered before with ransomware and the rise of ransomware and business email compromise. This is kind of this third major tier vector where they can come in and, if they're compromised, there could be a massive outage across industry. We saw this with some dealership ERP systems that went down a number of years ago, probably 2 years ago now, took out the better part of an industry in auto dealerships. But I think the important thing here is how are you involving them in incident response? Don't take for granted that, that they will be able to notify you if you don't have a direct contact there. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Knowing what data they have, knowing what communication vectors they have, I think it's really important. And then to kind of understand when you're understanding risk, calculating risk, talking about risk appetite and tolerances, make sure that you have some consideration for business partners, third parties, fourth parties, and potential suppliers, depending on what services or goods you may be receiving from other suppliers.
Yeah, something I've seen, unfortunately, as I think an example of this, a lot of organizations, large and small, will have a third-party IT provider, a traditional IT managed service provider, MSP, right? It could be help desk support all the way to server support to managing your firewalls, monitoring your environment. And, hackers have identified, I've seen instances where hackers target that IT provider through like phishing attacks and compromise them. I've also seen instances where the software that these IT providers use to manage and monitor all of their customers, the software has had vulnerabilities. So hackers can hack the software, and then from that, they can now directly control all of the IT provider's customers. And so they start by hacking your vendor, and now they have a direct line of access into your network from that relationship. So in my mind, that's an example that comes to mind of just understanding the risk there. And, there's a whole nother broad topic of vendor risk management, supply chain risk management that is beyond the scope of just this content here, but it's a good thing to keep in mind that exists.
Yeah, and just to hit really, really high level on that, you may hear and see this cybersecurity supply chain, securing your cybersecurity supply chain. from our perspective, you need to understand who you're using, what services you're using, and non-traditional cybersecurity supply chain as well. If you were a manufacturer, it's pretty obvious what the risk might be, but your IT persons may be acquiring software components and other tools that may impact your environment. So make sure you understand who's there. Make sure you understand who you're using across your organization. Evaluate what the potential risk might be for that relationship that you have. How do you integrate them into your enterprise risk management practices? And then when it comes to, if they're a critical top tier vendor that you can't, kind of aligns with your critical services or vital services, what does that look like from a contractual perspective? Do you have direct contacts there? Do you have clauses in contracts that obligate them to report in a timely manner if they experience an incident or disclose potential vulnerabilities in their systems? And so anyway, there's probably a whole hour that we could speak about cybersecurity supply chain, but it is important to involve them and consider them your suppliers in your incident response planning. So, we've kind of hit on this, the rise of some of these major threats and trends. It doesn't just hit from a traditional systems outage perspective. I think it is important as we get into talking about incident response plans in this next section that, whether it's a cyber attack, it's a natural disaster, your traditional outage, due to environmental factors, loss of power, et cetera, or it's a vendor and business partner outage. It's not just an IT thing. The more we can ingrain everyone into incident response planning or preparedness, the more likely we are to minimize that disruption and to preserve the ability to kind of have continuity of services and operations. So with that, I think we're going to transition to talking about incident response planning as a whole, and why is it important? What does it look like? What might it look like for you, and what might it look like for larger, more complex organizations? We'll give a couple of examples as we kind of go through this. So that integration with the organization across the board with vendor partners, and I think it becomes a little bit more difficult to start to differentiate business continuity with incident response. So we'll talk about kind of the continuum of what that might look like in a few minutes. More and more, they're looking at, because of the monetary gain that can be had by the industry and the growth trends that we've seen that we talked about before, the more disruptive they can be to your operations, the more likely you are to pay. And so they are targeting business operations, business disruptions. And so it's important to make sure that you are adequately prepared ahead of time and you have a framework for sustainable change. So what does an IRP look like, an incident response plan look like? There's kind of four primary areas that I like to talk about when we're talking about a robust incident response plan. What is incident response? What are the phases? I see organizations that have 1 to 2 page incident response plans all the way out to 60, 70 pages, depending on how complex you are operationally from an IT perspective, the types of data you have, your likelihood of being targeted, et cetera. But, the defined phases, preparation all the way down to detection. How are you identifying and escalating incidents? How do you analyze a potential incident? If it's just an event and a user account gets locked out, that's not an event. But if you have 40 of these happen at once and you start to lose access to systems, that might rise up. So detection analysis, there's this fine-tuned area of like containment and response while working on recovery, communication, remediation. And so all of this kind of happens at once, but defining what that looks like, what does your incident response plan look like? I think roles and responsibilities, the who of incident response planning. Everyone should have a role, all the way down to an individual user or employee that could be that first and potentially last line of defense when it comes to some of these cyber attacks. So defining the roles and responsibilities that are inherent in incident response planning. And that isn't just limited to individual employees. It isn't just limited to IT. It isn't just limited to members of the executive team. There's a lot of players that would need to be formally defined and fleshed out in a robust incident response plan. Prioritization and escalation protocols. What does good look like? What does bad look like? What does critical look like? What does medium look like? And how do you escalate that? So speaking the same language through either a rating criteria, severity rating, or even using things like colors. We all know red is green, or sorry, green is bad, green is good, red is bad. It's the classic headlight approach. Is that meaningful to include in your environment? And that the bottom bullet there, I think, is the most important. That's the living document. These threat-based run books. You don't have time, effort, resources to respond and anticipate everything. But for those high impact events that could happen, or those that are likely to be to resonate, that you can reasonably anticipate, start to develop scenarios, whether you do it reactively after you have an incident, or you can proactively develop run books for ransomware, business email compromise, basic disruptions, or the loss of, and you fill in the blank with the loss of. It is important to make sure that you are establishing protocols that could be repeatable and minimize the likelihood of you experiencing a disruption.
Yeah, I think that piece there is so critical. In the earlier panel, I know the panelists were talking about some of the challenges if your plan gets too big, right? Is it digestible? Can you execute on it effectively? And these run books allow you to kind of have the best of both worlds. You can have a formal incident response plan that is potentially larger, right? Has a lot of data in it. It could, you can define your processes there of kind of a workflow of how you work through an incident, all the contact information, right? Some of the key contact information, think of, key leadership that has to make business decisions. You're going to have probably legal counsel. Cyber insurance is going to be a key. If you have cyber insurance, you want the right contact information in your plan so you can initiate that in the event of an incident, right? And so could be public relations contacts in there. So that's all important and can cause your plan to get larger. But then what you're able to do is spin off what we call run books. And these run books are step-by-step instructions, typically more for IT and incident response personnel, to guide them through taking specific actions to respond to the incident. And we'll give an example later on, but think of that, if you have an email account compromise, what are the steps you want your IT folks to do to remedy that, to make sure that they do all the right things in the right order to minimize the impact and damage done there. So that run book can be a separate document that's short and sweet and to the point that can be handed to boots on the ground individuals to execute upon.
Yeah, but I just want to reiterate one more thing about the decision makers that would have to happen and be defined in an IRP. Who has the ability to make the call if you want to revert from your primary operations to your secondary operations? Who has the ability to say, we need to shut everything down for half a day? Who has the ability to make the call, are we paying the ransom or are we not? So making sure you flesh those out, whether it's in roles and responsibilities or it's in a run book for a specific threat type, making sure that you identify those ahead of time, because you don't want to be making that call on a Friday afternoon when multiple executives are on vacation or out of town, right? So making sure that you understand what that looks like. I think the level set on some definitions. Point of this slide is basically, incidents exist on a continuum. It could be very, very basic. The broad middle ground is where I like to operate. I would say, before it becomes a full business continuity plan event where massive disruptions of services happen, or you have to trigger disruption of continuity of operations or business continuity planning, making sure that you can escalate the potential incident up to being a real incident as quick as possible. And you may rule it out. It may be a false positive or maybe a minor incident, but making sure that you speak that language so that as soon as you suspect there might be an incident, you can escalate that, trigger your incident response plan. The error of crying wolf too soon is a little bit better than the error of not crying wolf soon, or not crying soon enough. And so I would just say, make sure you're speaking the same language, define minor, major, critical, or whatever your lingo ends up being, so that you understand if this happens, then you will escalate. And then, looking at the traditional incident response cycle, so to speak, we have a couple of visuals that are stacked on this slide and the next slide, where, it exists as an iterative continuous improvement effort. If you're familiar with quality improvements, quality systems, plan, do, check, act, is one of these things that if you look at preparation on the left, you need to anticipate, you need to prepare. You also need to know that you're going to learn from mistakes. You're going to have feeders after incidents happen, and that post-incident on the right will always feed back lessons learned into preparation. You need to continuously improve how you can adapt to those. The two middle phases on this, detection and analysis, is kind of in tandem. Are you detecting the right information? Do you have the right information? Can you preserve things like logging and events that may be indicative of where the attack happened, how big it was, what data got out the door, et cetera? And at the same time, being able to contain something that's happening live while preserving that forensic information to be able to tell the story, to eradicate it, and then potentially recover or revert to a different version, a backup version or something else. And I like to say, in a classic business continuity plan and an incident response plan, there's going to be a point where you have two teams working in tandem. It may not be all your team. It may be external providers through your cyber breach response, your cyber insurance, or a cyber breach response company that you hire to help you out. But there's this process where you will end up, trying to stop the bad actors, eradicate them from your environment, and preserve the scope and all of the information to recreate what happened, and then focusing on restoring that minimally viable services that you need to continue to deliver on your mission. And so, they need to work very, very much in tandem when it comes to that eradication and recovery phase. And then, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about what an incident response program might look like. And, I'll show you very robust, large organization with resources internally. And we'll talk first, though, about, what yours might look like. So this is a complicated incident response workflow. I'm not going to prescribe this to anyone on this call, but I will say there's a chance that your environment is, one or two people, and you call a cyber insurance provider. Right? So you may not have different levels, different steps. This workflow example demonstrates that there are various steps in that analysis phase that lead to decision points. Does it impact data? Does it impact personally identifiable information? Is it a breach? Does it qualify as a breach, or is it just a cyber incident? So speaking different languages and knowing that each one of them has their own decision tree, each one could require someone on the incident response team to make a decision about it. The process flow here basically says, is it an incident? Yes or no. Does it impact people? Yes or no. Does it impact data? Yes or no. And do we need to recover? And so the phases are pretty clearly outlined, but this is a fairly robust incident response plan that is representative of a highly complex organization. And a couple things, we mentioned this before, but making sure that you have BCP and incident response hand in hand, and that you are training your individuals, training your teams to speak the same language, that the team members that are dealing with your classic cyber incident response, might be your IT or InfoSec people, but that they need to be have a very clear line of communication with your classic business continuity program personnel. A couple slides on testing, and I think we're gonna transition over into doing a little bit more of a real world example. But testing as part of that spectrum of preparation, the post incident review, as well as establishing a program that's more formal, identifying potential gaps, weaknesses, making sure that those who need to have business continuity knowledge and have incident response knowledge have it, that they understand their role. They understand the dependencies that they have within your environment. They have direct lines of communication to vendor partners if you have it. And so I always say part of your testing program should include it should include regulators if you have regulatory requirements. It should include reporting relationships for anyone you'd have to report to in consumer protection agencies and the like. Make sure you include critical vendors, third parties, fourth parties, and your business partners in this testing as well. Here's a few examples of the types of testing that you could do. So simulations and tabletops, that's your classic incident response. Everyone in the war room, so to speak, talking through what you would do, walking through a scenario, a series of knowns and unknowns, making these things routine, making the types of scenarios that may hit your environment, indicative of what is happening in the real world. There's the functional testing where you're actually doing some failovers, reverting back to previous systems, trying to align with that business continuity plan. There's call tree drills. If I were to call you on a Friday afternoon, how quickly could you get spin up a Teams chat, spin up a Zoom call, or if you have any alternative means of emergency communications, is that effective and is that not? And then taking the opportunity in the bottom to participate in vendor continuity testing. A lot of your software as a service providers, platform providers offer you the opportunity to participate. You should take them up on it and make sure you plan to involve them in yours as well if you have the ability to do that through your contract. Yeah, and again, this slide is more focused on the technical aspect of it. So making sure that not only does the feature and the function work within the technology to either back up, to restore, to fail over, or to have an immutable in that bottom right bullet, a mutable offline backup. Is it actually immutable? Is it actually separate? Can you actually get to it or not? In some cases, there are misconfigurations of the separation or offline backups that would need to be validated to make sure that you really are resilient against a traditional ransomware attack.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in there real quick as an example. I get the privilege of working with our team here at Sealite that does simulated hacking. We do penetration testing, so we test our clients' networks, and a lot of the testing in the last several years has been around their backup systems because organizations know backups are so critical. They want to know, are our backups secure from like a ransomware attack? And we commonly find that there are gaps in their control structure that could allow an attacker to get there. So I'll get in the weeds technically for a moment for any of the IT folks on the call. As an example, I've seen, an organization have a backup appliance that is not joined to Active Directory. So it's kind of isolated from the domain, right? So if the domain gets compromised, they can't just get into the backups. However, that backup appliance was a virtual machine that was on a virtual server that was joined to the domain. And so they weren't aware of that. And so if an IT admin account was compromised, it would be possible to go to the host server, then to get into the backup appliance, and then they could delete all the backups from there. Just as an example of making sure you've really evaluated how well secure are your backups. Are they truly immutable, meaning they can't be modified, or are they truly offline, off network, so they can't be attacked from a compromise of your network?
Yeah, thanks for that, David.
Yeah. So with that, I think it's good to jump into a case study. We'll end the session here today on this case study, and it will highlight some opportunities, I think, for everyone here to go back and see, what are your current capabilities, and if you could respond to this type of attack quickly and efficiently, or if there's room for improvement within your own organization. And so I'm going to use the classic business email compromise. So at the beginning, I said that one of the most common cyber insurance claims is around hackers getting in the email system and then facilitating some form of financial fraud. Here's a real life example from a client of ours. So in this instance, the controller of this business sent an email to the accounts payable department to process this new invoice. The AP team saw this email and it thought it looked odd. So they looked at it, they're like, the context doesn't make sense. I don't recognize this vendor. So let's just wait in. We know that the controller arrives to work in 30 to 60 minutes. Let's just hold off. The controller arrives at work and the accounts payable team goes and talks, says, hey, did you send this email? What is this about? And the controller's like, whoa, I didn't send that email. That did not come from me. So they start to get scared and contact the IT team right away and saying, hey, we may have an issue here. So the IT security team was involved. They came and investigated and they saw, okay, this looks like a cyber attack. So they confirmed with the finance team, one, can we confirm that we did not pay this vendor? And they're like, correct. We did not process this invoice. We did not send money out. Okay, good. They looked and it says, okay, it looks like the controller's email was hacked. So they reset the controller's password and they're like, whew, good, dodged a bullet. Think about this. Are they good now? What are your thoughts? Well, 3 months later there was I think it was the board meeting. They had a board meeting and it was just brought up that, oh, by the way, we had a little incident. The controller's email was hacked, but we remedied it right away. And the board was like, that sounds pretty bad. Are we sure we have our ducks in a row and that we didn't miss anything? So they contacted us to come investigate. And they're like, can you just independently review this incident and make sure that we're good, right? Well, we went in and what do you think that an incident response team wants when they come and try to review an incident? Well, one key piece of information we want is the logs. We want log data from the relevant systems. Well, they were in Microsoft 365 and they had default settings which kept access logs for 30 days. Remember, this is 3 months later. So we go in and the original logs for that time period are gone. Luckily, the IT team saved a copy of some of the logs from their initial investigation. So we were able to get a copy of the original fraudulent email and we got some of the log data. We looked at the email. What you see in the screenshot here that's highlighted is there's a component of investigating the email because we wanted to say, truly, was the controller's password compromised? What's highlighted here is saying, yes, it was. The hacker sent the email as they were authenticated, meaning they had the credentials for the controller. Okay, so that's bad news. We did confirm that, yes, the controller's account was compromised. So then we looked at the log data and we saw, okay, what logins occurred? And we saw a few logins in the logs in the next image that show some of the logins came from this IP address that when you look it up, it comes from Ukraine. And we're like, hey, controller, did you go to Ukraine sometime in the last 4 or 5 months? I'm like, nope, haven't gone over there. Many reasons not to right now, right? Okay. Well, then we start looking further into the log data and we start looking at failed logins. And on the next image, what we see here are failed login attempts by day. And what you see highlighted in yellow are weekends. And we asked the controller, were you logging in on those weekends? And the controller's like, I wasn't working several of those weekends, and just that number of failed login attempts doesn't align with, I can think back, I mistype my password periodically, but, on May 1st, I did not mistype my password 12 times. Or on May 17th, I did not mistype my password 17 times. So this is indicative of a password guessing attack showing a fraudster attempting to log in over and over and over. And so we asked the controller, hey, you've already changed your password. What was your password? And it was something like the season in the year. Think of like a spring 2025 exclamation mark. Well, that's a very common convention, and hackers know that. And so it's a common attack that they perform, is trying to guess passwords like that. And here, then we started looking at some of the other access logs, and something that popped out was one of the logins occurred from the Outlook desktop client. What does that mean? If you get a brand new computer and you log in with Outlook, what does Outlook do? It downloads and synchronizes all the email and all the data. So what we can infer here is the hacker synchronized the whole Outlook profile for the controller, and the controller had 8 years worth of data in their email. All sorts of emails, attachments, contacts, calendar events, etc. And so is that a bad thing? Classic consultant answer, it depends, right? Well, it depends on what's in the email. So we reviewed what was in the email, and unfortunately for them, over the years, several different corporate credit cards had been exchanged via email, and they had several reports from employees where they dumped a report out of their platform, and they had employee name, address, social security number in there. And so all their employees' private data was compromised as part of this. And so they ended up having to notify all of their employees that their data was compromised, and deal with that aftermath. And so in the last couple minutes here, tying it all back together with an incident response plan, we talked earlier that you can have this plan with the key elements of, how do you define the plan, the workflow, key contact information, but we talked about that playbook. And here's the example I'd want to leave you with from that, is that business email compromise is so common that I would encourage you, if you don't already, to have a playbook related to how to respond to an email compromise. This is condensed, so there's a little more that would go into it, but it is super straightforward and very practical for the IT folks, right? Disable the account, reset the password, export and collect all the logs, review the mail forwarding rules if there's any malicious rules in there, then review login activity, look at any permission changes, or did the hacker try to establish any persistence in the email mailbox? Review the email, see what data was potentially exposed. And to that point right there, as an example, Microsoft 365 has varying licenses. Their more advanced licenses give you more logs. It costs more, but their more advanced licenses can tell you every email and every file touched. So if you had a compromise, you could actually determine in the logs what data was exposed. Whereas with some of the cheaper licenses, it doesn't give you that granular detail, and you have to kind of assume the whole mailbox was compromised. And so this is a very practical way to start getting your incident response plan off the ground, is getting these playbooks built out for the most common type of cyber attacks that you're going to encounter. And then for some of the more bigger complex ones, if we take ransomware, there's going to be, in your playbook, likely pretty quickly, once you identify a ransomware attack, your playbook is going to be, contact cyber insurance and engage a third party to assist, right? So it doesn't need to be super complicated, but it's going to be practically what are your team members expected to do. So with that, Nowacki, why don't you take us home here, and if we kind of paint the picture for kind of all that we talked about today, and wrap us up here.
Yeah, and I think, wrapping up, obviously the incident response, cyber incident response exists as part of a broader framework that includes business continuity, that includes minimizing the likelihood of having a cyber attack by quantifying the types of risks and the impacts that it could have, so that you know how quickly you can escalate. So it's going to minimize damage, minimize disruption, minimize reputational harm, and ultimately, hopefully you will not experience as much downtime. It allows you to protect sensitive data or know where to go in the event of an incident, to detect or recreate if data went out and how far data went and where it went. It supports compliance with regulatory requirements, GLBA if you're subject to that, HIPAA, any consumer privacy laws for constituents that may have data in your systems or maybe users of your systems. And overall, because of the nature of a mature, robust incident response program, whether it's simple or it's very comprehensive, to make sure you're collecting lessons. When you have an incident, you don't want the knowledge that's gained to fall off right after that. You want to feed that back into your program. You want to feed that back into your practice of responding to incidents, and you want to develop more defined playbooks to help you kind of navigate common incidents that you're likely to face in the future. So with that, any questions? Open floor for discussions. We're nearly at time. What are your concerns when it comes to incident response or resiliency, continuity? Feel free to throw those in the chat, or if you'd like, you can send them and we can respond to it after.
Did just want to mention that during the session, I actually did receive a phishing email from someone posing as being from one of our customers. So it's very timely.
Yeah. Well, we'd like to just thank HAI for the opportunity to come this afternoon and talk to you all about this. It just shows how serious they take it, and we appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts and insights with you all. Hopefully you found it informative and engaging. And again, any questions, please reach out to the HAI team and they can get questions over to us.
Thank you, David and Dave, for such an informative session. There really is a lot to consider in the ever-changing landscape of cybersecurity. A big thank you also to our attendees for joining Cybersecurity Spotlight, responding to cyber incidents, and for being a part of our 2025 HAI Group Virtual Risk Management Conference. I saw a lot of the same names on multiple sessions today, and we appreciate your support. We know how busy you all are, and it means so much to us that you took the time today to learn more about business continuity. We hope you found today to be valuable and are leaving with new insights to strengthen risk management and resilience across your organization. As a reminder, recordings of all session materials will be shared with registered attendees after the conference. We will also be sending out a survey regarding the sessions you attended today. We appreciate your time completing the survey, as your feedback will help us improve the virtual conference for next year. For any follow-up, please send questions to events@haigroup.com. And on behalf of everyone at HAI Group, thanks for spending the day with us.